I thought Vance was kind of a mediocre pick.
One presidential candidate almost got assassinated. Another is getting assassinated by Father Time.
People in politics are not really my crowd.
All right. I am here with Nate Silver, who is a man of many talents. He's been a baseball analyst, a blogger, a legendary election forecaster, and founder of 538. He's been at the Times, at ESPN. He's a professional poker player and an author. My first introduction to your work, Nate, was through your book, The Signal and the Noise. And you have a new book coming out, which we'll talk about. And of course, you have a wildly successful Substack at natesilver.net. Nate, Welcome to Substack Summerfest. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you, Chris. And hello, everybody.
Yeah, you've got the whole team listening. So any complaints that you have will be very speedily addressed immediately after this. Well, let me just get this out of the way. I'm going to ask you politics questions. We've had a wild week. One presidential candidate almost got assassinated. Another is getting assassinated by Father Time. We have a VP pick. First of all, how do you think this influenced the election and the general state of politics, but also how does it influence your forecasting? Yeah,
look, I think what's important is that a model of the election, like our model, if you look up Silver Bulletin today, has Biden with the 28% chance of winning, so Trump is at 72%, therefore. It's important to understand the limitations of models in a circumstance like this. And it's like partly what a platform like Substack helps with, is you can kind of provide newsletters that talk people through the thinking behind the model and not just the numbers without any context. So one big complication is that there's a good chance, maybe over 50-50, if you go to prediction markets at 75 or 80%, that Joe Biden will not be the nominee on November 5th. Our model is making a conditional forecast. If Biden is the nominee, what's his chance of winning? Realistically, less than a 28% chance that Biden both survives this challenge to the nomination and then wins the election, right? Also, models are based on a relatively small sample of data, and you sometimes encounter unprecedented circumstances. He is not that far behind. A couple of points in the national polls, maybe more like 4 points in states like Pennsylvania, which is not great, but not horrible. The problem is that a normal campaign wouldn't be raising questions every time he does a speech or gives an interview or things like that. And right now he's kind of resting in Delaware with COVID, which is not his fault. But all the things that a campaign would ordinarily need to come back. The Biden campaign is projecting a 75% drop in their high donor fundraising, for example. Usually fundraising kind of washes out in the presidential election, but not when it falls off by 75% necessarily. The fact that you have all these Democratic surrogates going on TV and criticizing the president. Nancy Pelosi saying he needs to drop out. Barack Obama saying, I'm going to leak to the Washington Post or whatever, that he needs to drop out. That's a very unusual circumstance. And it's kind of past the point of no return now, where you can kind of put that back into, I forget what metaphor we're trying to use here. The floodgates are more than open. They've been open for about a week now, and you can't undo that. And so, look, I don't think Biden's chances are zero, but it's a case where, like I said, a model is just a tool. It is not the end stage of things, and you have to recognize situations where it presents an incomplete picture.
And you've written about sort of what you called it the broken leg problem, where if there's something that's kind of out of sample that the model's not designed to account for, you have to be willing to use your brain. On the flip side, there's been lots of situations where people have wanted to make special pleading and make excuses not to listen to the model when that doesn't make sense. How do you make like a principled distinction between those two?
Well, this is kind of where the art and the experience come in a little bit, I think, Chris, because it's like hard to have, you could make the comparison to Trump in 2016, where after the Access Hollywood tape, for example, there were calls for him to drop out. I mean, let me point out one thing, though, about that Trump counterexample. So Trump had two things that went really right for him. One is that in the waning days of the 2016 campaign, you had James Comey, the director of the FBI, issue a letter saying, oh, actually, we're investigating Hillary Clinton again because Anthony Weiner had some documents on his laptop that he was showing like dick pics to his girlfriends with, right?
Perfect name for that whole scandal.
Yeah, so there's that, and the fact that the polls were fairly far off in 2016, right? So if there is some big development that favors Biden, and then if there's a polling error, he could win, and that's why it's not zero. Even if 27% is too high, it's like not zero exactly. But with that said, I mean, first of all, the plain fact that he is 81 years old and wants to be president until he's 86 years old is, I think, a salient fact, right? Like, our model actually gives some credit to Biden for coming back. It says right now he's down by 2.5 points nationally, but we expect the race to tighten up to 0.5 point in the popular vote. He's an underdog because he's an underdog in the Electoral College. If you had enough data, you might say, well, we've run 1,000 elections in a simulated universe that ChatGPT creates or something, right? And like, it turns out that candidates who are over 80 years old suffer a penalty for it, right? Like, I think you would expect. I mean, I've seen some people try to build congressional forecasts where you have a lot more data, and they find that these octogenarian candidates actually do underperform a little bit. So if there's this mystery, the economy is kind of doing better and the stock market's up and the consumer confidence numbers are improving, And meanwhile, by the way, Democrats are doing pretty well actually in polls of like the Senate, for example, or at least they kind of were until these current headwinds became pretty bad. And if you ask voters in polls, 85% of them say that he's too old. In some polls, between half and 2/3 of Democrats think he should drop out. So it's just kind of like, it's being willing to point out the obvious. And as much as the Biden campaign might complain about, you go on Morning Joe, whatever, complain about elites when you're trying to influence elites, this has been a problem the whole time. And I was kind of dug in as of about a year ago, late August last year, I began to get worried. And when I say worried, full transparency, I'm somebody who is not a huge fan of Trump, right? I'll probably vote third party this year if Biden remains the alternative. I think it's pretty unacceptable to run a candidate in this condition. But when voters are sending that clear a message, and when it kind of matches reasonable priors, I mean, I wouldn't want an 81-year-old airline pilot. If I were running a company and had to pick a CEO, I wouldn't probably want an 81-year-old. If I do, sure, yeah, Warren Buffett could run Substack or Silver Bulletin. That would be okay, right? But I would want that 81-year-old to be tip-top, unquestionable shape, and instead, the Biden White House has been kind of dodging and weaving the whole time. For example, I thought not doing a Super Bowl interview, which is something almost every president had done. You're going to have the biggest Super Bowl of all time, Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift and whatever else, right? Good game. Doesn't do an interview like that. Seemed like a sign of trying to limit his media appearances. And I think they kind of like adopted a strategy with 9 months to go in the campaign of like, yeah, if Biden had some health problem that surfaced, let's say that like Biden had a little stroke with 5 days to go, right? Maybe you could make some BS up about like, oh, maybe he has COVID or something like that. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that his current COVID diagnosis is false, but you could kind of BS your way through things. What you can't do is like have such a weak hand when you're in a repeated game where you have to keep playing those weak cards over and over again, and people now know that you're bluffing because they've seen the hand so many times before, right? The fact is that they can't quiet doubts about Biden because those doubts are legitimate. I mean, every other public appearance goes quite badly. The half that go okay are only kind of judged on this gigantic curve, I don't think. When you have him go out there and do more public appearances, then yes, on the one hand, that quells the questions of people like me, why isn't he out there doing more? But on the other hand, the performance isn't very good. And they've had their hand forced into kind of showing their hand, and it's not a very good hand. They've also been bullies toward people in the Democratic Party. There was a representative from Michigan, Democratic representative from a swing district, who came out and said, I think Biden should step aside. They tried to cut off her fundraising. They've been trying to railroad through an earlier date for nominating Biden. He hasn't apparently seen a neurologist since February, even though these conditions can rapidly deteriorate a fair bit. So they just have been kind of, I mean, their bluff got called, but we're still like in the middle of the tournament and like we're still playing the hand. It's just very weird. It's just very weird. And I think it's not a normal circumstance. And I think, again, I'm not saying it's zero. And I recognize at this point, if Biden stays in and wins, then I'll look foolish, and that's okay. That's kind of the nature of the business, is you're trying to make probabilistic assessments based on incomplete information.
Right. You don't want to get
but-
stuck resulting like you might in poker by regretting a good move just because it didn't come out your way.
Yeah, and like I also think it's important. I mean, look, there are years when, because you have the forecast, you also have this kind of more subjective way you discuss the forecast and lean into the forecast. And there have been past years, like in 2016, our model had Clinton favored, although not by as much as the other models. We had Trump at 29%, 30%, 29%, I think, on election day. In that election, I thought it was important to talk about the uncertainty in the forecast a lot, because people took for granted too much that Clinton would win. This time, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, one thing that's also been true is that the polls have barely moved, right? Biden has the worst debate. Well, first of all, Trump gets convicted on 37 felony charges. The polls move by maybe half a point toward Biden, right? A few weeks later, Biden has the worst debate in history. The polls move by maybe 2 points back toward Trump, right? There's an assassination attempt against Trump. It's too early to say what the polls will say. It looks though maybe like 1 point for an assassination attempt, right? So if nothing moves the polls, and Biden's not really capable of firing on all cylinders, then how does he get back into a place where he's got to win the popular vote by 2 points to overcome the electoral college disadvantage? And like I said, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but a model is a tool, and in small sample problems where we only get one election every 4 years, you have to use your brain in concert with the model.
Now, I've seen a bunch of complaints from all quarters on the internet these days complaining about how the quality and tenor of media coverage influences our politics. Do you buy that at all? And do you think about that when you're doing your work?
I think one other advantage I have is that I'm someone who's been kind of embedded within the news media, right? I've written worked at the New York Times and ABC News and ESPN and have a big podcast company that's corporate and a big corporate publisher for the book, and I like them all. But I am fairly critical of the political class of people, right? I think kind of politics gives people brain worms. I think that it's hard to maintain a position where you don't become swallowed by partisanship. And kind of one problem that we have in the country is that the expert class is overwhelmingly kind of liberal Democrats, and that's okay. I mean, I think that's one advantage the Democratic Party has. I think it probably will kind of govern to a higher standard of competence when formulating regulations or things like that. But people, it's a big blob. I call it the indigo blob, right? We're kind of the nonpartisan functions and the partisan functions are all kind of smushed together. And so, the New York Times, for example, is both a centrist news organization and a left-leaning news organization. Because there aren't many news organizations that have that much influence, and so it's both kind of the unofficial organ of liberal thought and a place where people are very old school in some ways and want to avoid the appearance of nonpartisanship. And it depends on kind of what subject they're covering and who the author is and who the editor is and things like that, right? So I think being a little skeptical of the media, but knowing how the media works is an advantage too, and knowing how politicians work and knowing how not really kind of the White House was telling, I think, running a pretty obvious bluff when it came to things like Biden's availability for public appearances, right? They were saying, oh, people don't want to be bothered on the Super Bowl by having a big political commercial. Well, yeah, look, people pay millions of dollars for a 30-second ad on the Super Bowl. These interviews are typically softball interviews. So what's the earned media value of having a 20-minute interview or whatever in the middle of halftime? Probably very high. So I think being willing to say, yeah, these people are kind of bluffing, or in some cases outright lying, and they rationalize it by saying, oh, we're kind of serving the greater good. I mean, I'm skeptical about how well that works in the long term.
I want to ask you about Substack. As you mentioned, you've done a bunch of tours at all kinds of firmaments of mainstream media. You've you're one of the heroes of the blogging era. You've kind of done all the bits and pieces. In that arc, what does it feel like to start on Substack? Does it feel like a return of blogging? Does it feel like something else? What do you make of Substack given all of that experience?
Yeah, look, from the moment I kind of heard about Substack, I had an inkling that this was a route I might want to go in the future. I mean, I think if you check different boxes for what makes for someone who's going to be good on a platform like Substack, then then I think I check those, right? So to kind of do this offhand, like one category is like being able to write quickly. I mean, I'm notorious for having a fair amount of typos, right? But I can write coherently and occasionally entertainingly, pretty quickly, turn a long post around in a couple of hours. And I like writing actually most of the time. That's one big thing. To have a nerdy topic where you provide some differentiation and specialization, I think is another good factor. I think also this is going to sound like a little bit more, I guess, cynical, Chris, or whatever, right? But like, I think things that are more analytical and metrics driven tend to attract a customer that has like a higher willingness to pay. I'm just like fortunate in that regard. I mean, if you go and look at like the Substack leaderboards, like the politics newsletters are charging $5 or $6 or $7 a month, and the finance ones are charging $25 a month or something like that. I try to kind of somewhat split that difference with $10 a month. But the point is that I happen to have expertise in the field where there is a subscriber friendly audience, I think. And the fact that like, even though I was nominally the editor at 538, I mean, you have a lot of constraints when you have a large staff. You have a lot of constraints when you work for a giant news organization called ABC News, which is a part of the Disney company, one of the largest media companies on earth, and the average viewer of ABC News is 70 years old or something. So I think I can write with a lot more dexterity and kind of voice when I'm not as constrained by like the style guide of an ABC News or a New York Times. And it's just much easier to be honest about things, including being honest about the fact that like one thing that's interesting but also kind of awkward is the fact that these models are now being used as part of the debate over like whether Biden should remain in the race. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to like have a view on that. I mean, I think Biden should drop out for many reasons, right? I think if I tried to like hide that behind some veneer of, I'm just kind of doing my neutral analysis, I think that would be poor, right? I think I am trying to be objective here as I can. I think there are lots of data-driven reasons and also lots of kind of model-driven reasons why I think Biden should probably drop out. By the way, I'm not sure he should be even president. I personally feel safer with Kamala Harris getting the 3 a.m. phone call at this point. I think she has more uptime. But I think it's important for me to be saying, like, look, our forecast says Trump favored. That's not the outcome I want to see happen. I'm not a Trump fan, right? And to be able to kind of disclose how I feel about things, and this is coming from a point of deep rigorousness on the one hand, maybe this isn't, maybe this is me speculating on the other hand, right? Or sometimes even kind of saying like, hey, look, it's late at night, you're expecting me to say something, right? But kind of treat this post like it's in Comic Sans font or something like that. That's a lot easier when you're kind of writing for yourself, and the slight informality of a Substack. I mean, I was talking with my partner, who's a recovering graphic designer, about this last night, and there are people like the Free Press or the Bulwark or whatever that have done like a lot of custom design tweaks, and I might do that at some point. But I kind of like the informal, lo-fi nature of things. I find that email distribution is also a really good mechanism to kind of guarantee a lot of momentum and a high floor for most posts. I think we're it is a we now. There's me and Eli, my assistant elections analyst. We get about half our traffic from the web client and half from email, roughly. And so we're kind of serving both those audiences. But, once you get momentum going, and believe me, it took a few months, then you kind of both get this kind of high floor for posts because of the email and also the high ceiling. Things can still go somewhat viral. I mean, it's muted as compared with a few years ago. Twitter discourages outside links as much. There's a bit less groupthink, which I think is good, but you can still get like a high degree of visibility too if you're persistent about kind of being in people's inboxes a couple of times a week.
And we're working on making it possible to go viral within Substack, of course, which will be an extra.
Yeah, no, the internal referrals are nice for sure, and the fact that once you kind of have somebody's credit card info because they subscribe to another Substack, that it's kind of one click away, and the recommendations are good. And I'm not trying to flatter you too much, Chris, but there is a lot of good writing on Substack that was scattered all around the internet a couple of years ago, or maybe wasn't existing because people were too constrained by highly corporate employers. And I think the political moment has shifted more toward a time of more open, kind of heterodox discourse in general. But I subscribe to a lot of Substacks. It's kind of a reciprocity thing, right? There are like often 4 or 5 really good items that I'm reading every day, and that provides a lot of value. Maybe it'll kind of equilibrium its way out in in a couple of years. But for the time being, I'm just really glad that like I took this route, because I didn't know. I was making kind of wild guesses about how many subscribers you'd eventually get. There was some interest from external news organizations, but to the incentives to like own your own work product and be like, I could go out for a walk today, and sometimes you do, or I could write a post and generate X amount of expected value. I mean, I think it's going from a place where I had no incentive compensation at all for 10 years to where it's very linear between kind of effort level and income. Then for now it's very motivating. Maybe in a year I'll feel trapped by it or something, but for now the incentives seem pretty well aligned.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and I've been a paid subscriber since the beginning. I've been following along. It seems like you're having a lot of fun with it, which is always the part that gives me the most energy. But I should ask, while you've got the team here, what sucks about it? What's the worst part about Substack?
Those are good questions. I mean, I think at first I worried a little bit about the graphics and the tools for displaying data visualizations. Data Wrapper is the third-party provider that we're using that is pretty good. I mean, you can it's a little bit of work, but they are kind of Substack friendly and Substack compatible, so that helps a fair bit. Yeah, I mean, look, I think almost everything kind of falls in the category of the ability to do more customizations, right? To put different kind of frames and things that you're kind of embedding in the post. I mean, as we see, I think the stereotype was kind of Substack was originally for kind of essayists and things like that. But now more and more you see data-friendly people, finance, sports, election nerd stuff. You see more people using it that way, and so the tools for data visualization, I think, are going to become more important. I mean, look, there are always like tiny little things that one can complain about. One weird situation that I face is I kind of have interest in these one-off products, like for the NCAA basketball tournament. There are some people that just want to have access to that model and will unsubscribe immediately.
Yeah.
So they have a choice between like an annual subscription for $95 and a monthly subscription for $10, which they're almost certainly going to churn. It might be more efficient to say, $25 for just getting this one-off series of pieces, and then maybe we'll send you an email, give you an option to subscribe for a 20% discount or something like that, right? But have a little more customization of that kind of thing might be helpful potentially.
I had one other non-book related question for you, which is, I sometimes think of Substack as almost a social technology. We do a bunch of publishing technology, but it's sort of like the social piece of it is making new things able to thrive. Another technology like that I'm very interested in following very closely is prediction markets. I'm following the poly market folks very closely, and I'm just curious, how much do you watch the prediction markets? How do you think about your predictions shaping them, their predictions influencing you? Is this on your brain at all?
Yeah, so I actually am a consultant, an advisor to Polymarket, I should say. So I have self-interested reasons to promote them. But look, I think this circumstance we've seen recently is a case where you kind of need prediction markets because models themselves won't really do the job, right? Like, there's not really a great way to build a statistical model of Joe Biden's likelihood of dropping out. There is not a good way in the aftermath immediately of Biden's debate. I mean, it was kind of like talking with people and having conversations about, like, is this going to affect him by 2 points or 1 point or 3 points or whatever else, right? And how would that affect the odds? I mean, the fact is that if you're working in finance, if you're working for an investment bank or a hedge fund that's trying to hedge election risk or even make, plus EV expected value bets based on election risk, that they have to come to judgments immediately with incomplete information that won't yet be reflected in the polling. So a case like this, where there's a lot of news that leads to polling, that's when prediction markets, I think, are very valuable. Now, in cases where it's more normal course of business, look, I think some of the models are pretty good historically. 538's models, when I ran them, were more accurate than prediction markets by a fair bit. However, I think this is hitting some inflection point. Polymarket has a lot of liquidity that was lacking in the past, and I think they have kind of more rational pricing than I've seen in the past. I know firsthand, because when I was kind of doing this tour of different things I wanted to do, I know that there are financial firms that are taking political risk much more seriously. If kind of everything is politics now and you're trying to figure out kind of what will interest rates be next year, or what's this mean for the healthcare sector if I'm investing in equities in healthcare, the election's a very material factor. And international elections too, France and the UK and India and places like that. So I think we've reached some turning point or tipping point where prediction markets are playing a more important role.
Speaking of risk, you have a new book coming out, On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Am I right in thinking this is almost a synthesis of a bunch of different pieces of your polyglot career? Yeah,
look, I mean, it's kind of three things in one, right? It's on the one hand, there's a lot of deep, very involved reporting, kind of almost on the scene kind of gonzo journalism stuff, where I'm like with Sam Bankman-Fried in the Bahamas, like 5 days before he gets arrested. I'm like making all these deep runs on the World Series of Poker, right? I'm like attending these secret VC conferences in Utah, I guess not so secret now, but like things like that, right? So you're kind of very much, you're at big crypto parties in Miami, the kind of week when Bitcoin hits its first all-time high. So you're very much on the scene. I was immersed in this life for like 3 years. There's like a reporting kind of narrative component. Then there's like kind of more of an explainer component. There's a lot about how game theory works. There's a lot about things like what's the history of Las Vegas and the gaming industry? Why is sports betting so ubiquitous now? Questions like that. Also a lot about actually large language models and AI. I think there's like a really good explainer about like how ChatGPT works. But it's also part memoir. I mean, part of what I discovered in writing the book, it takes place in the world I call the river. The river is like a gambling term, a world of risk. Is that I discovered that there is like a like-minded community of people. Certainly in poker, you meet people who I met a lot of people who think like I do and I feel very comfortable around in things like prediction markets. You go to conferences that like Polymarket or Manifold has and things like that. The fact that like some of the top VCs, I never had really spent much time in Silicon Valley, that they would kind of enthusiastically take my emails or my phone calls and be willing to talk because they didn't see me as a typical kind of left-wing journalist, I guess, right? Like that was all very validating, and it kind of encouraged the notion that like, this kind of tribe of people in politics are not really my tribe. And that gets to the Substack too, where like at this point the forecasts have like a reasonably wide audience. The average post is getting 150,000 page views or something, which is I think actually better than it did at 538. But like the forecast page at 538 would get millions and millions of page views, but most of it are from people who are either partisans or don't really understand the nature of probabilistic forecasts. So it's like, okay, Nate, you have this like medium-sized influential community of people that kind of really get what you do, or you can go on Good Morning America and talk to a bunch of 70-year-olds watching ABC News at 7 in the morning. It's like, okay, that's not really, both for lifestyle and in the long run, I think financial reasons, going for the audience, it's a little bit more self-selected and narrower, I think is more worthwhile. And it's a world that really exists. I mean, like all these people, I mean, what it really is a combination of two things. It's people who are really analytical, like that part's obvious. These are people who are pretty quantitative for the most part, crossed with people who are really competitive. They really want to win. I mean, poker, certainly, people are incredibly competitive. Venture capital, people are almost irrationally competitive in terms of having like a chip on their shoulder, I think sometimes. That personality overlap, empirically, if you look at like personality studies, which are a mixed quality, but like that's actually pretty rare. Often people who are risk-taking are kind of not very analytical, they're kind of very fly-by-night, right? Often people who are analytical are kind of neurotic and careful, like the actuary personality type. When you have that combination, then it's very high upside and high downside, I think.
Degens of the world unite.
Yeah, degens of the world unite. In my world, the term degen in poker is kind of used as like a compliment, right? It means that you're willing to gamble and take risks, that you're probably a fun person to hang out with. And so, look, what the book tries to do is says, if you're interested in this world, then you're getting like a first-person guided tour that's very well informed of like this neighborhood, right? If you're not, if you're some person in the political class, I hope you still will read the book, because like it'll give you like a guide to like, how does someone like Elon Musk or Sam Bankman-Fried or Sam Altman, I don't mean to lump those three together, they're three very different cases, obviously, right? But like, or Peter Thiel, how do these people actually think? What motivates them? What is real and what's fake? And like explaining them in their own terms, I think, is worthwhile, and kind of translating back and forth between these two worlds.
Well, I'm going to buy the book. Everybody listening should too. Is it true that you find the fault line between the rationalists and the effective altruists? Or is that a secret
so
reveal?
Among other things, it's a long book. It's like 550 pages. It goes into like a lot of the history of these kind of twin movements of effective altruism and rationalism, which I think are actually in some ways more different than people kind of assume. But it tries to trace a pretty careful historical lineage of where these movements have emerged from. It offers what I think is a very constructive critique of effective altruism. There's like a 3,000 word critique of what's it called? Utilitarianism at some point in the middle of the book. So like you're getting a lot of, one thing Tyler Cowen, the economist and polymathic economist / intellectual at GMU will say is like, he likes books that are interesting on every page, and that's what this book is trying to do, right? It's trying to immerse you in things and show you something you're not expecting on on nearly every page, right? There's like not a lot of like boilerplate historical description. You can condense 200 years of Las Vegas history down to a page and a half or things like that. There are lots of people who are fascinating people, from like not just like VCs, also people like other risk takers like astronauts and explorers and athletes and things like that, who I give a lot of space to kind of breathe in their own terms. Because when you spend 3 years on something, I interviewed 200 really interesting people, you have a lot of material to work with, right? So even in a long book, you're kind of using the better third of that stuff. And like, I think there's a lot there. I think I recently read the audiobook, which was a big challenge, but it turned out pretty well. I think it does work well if you read it straight through as a narrative, but if you hop around from place to place, I think that works perfectly well too.
Fantastic. All right, well, if you're up for it, let's take a couple questions from folks here at Substack.
Cool.
Who are sitting in the giant room.
Hi, Nate. I'm Sophia. I'm the head of writer relations at
Hey,
Substack.
Sophia.
I have two questions, actually. One is, what is your favorite Substack as a reader, to read as a reader? And the second one is, what's the last great book you've read? And it could be even something maybe that you read to research for your book as you were writing it.
Let me answer the second question first. It's a very long book, so I didn't read every word. But one book that's quite influential on my book is the book "The Making of the Atomic Bomb" by Richard Rhodes, I think, is the author, which kind of lines up with the movie Oppenheimer and things like that. But the book winds up talking a lot about existential risk, and this moment where these kind of very flawed and frail kind of physicists create a device that can destroy the world is this extremely human and dramatic moment, and I think he's at the risk of being forgotten about a little bit. I mean, almost no one alive remembers Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that book was, toward the end of my process, I think was very influential. In terms of Substackers, I mean, for the most part, the people that have a lot of overlap with the 538, with the Silver Bulletin audience are people I read and like a lot. Matt Iglesias, Slow Boring, is the one who I think has the highest subscriber overlap, and I really admire his ability to like turn out a really good, well-written post at like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. every day. Sometimes I'm on Vegas time, still awake at 5 a.m., and the Slow Boring newsletter comes through. But I'm also trying to do a better job of highlighting maybe less well-known people. My view about the recommendation page is to include lots and lots and lots of people, so they can get a taste for different things. I don't necessarily endorse every single thing that every Substacker writes, but it is impressive. If you look at the politics Substack leaderboard, it really is kind of a mix of left, center, right, relatively nonpartisan, but some of it's more partisan. It really is like the stereotype about, it's only a certain type of person's on Substack. I mean, like, I probably fit that stereotype to some degree, or like Iglesias does. But like, I think it's like no longer true. It's just one of the most interesting places for coverage of politics, culture, etc.
Thank you. It's great to hear. And thanks for doing this interview with us.
Of course.
Hi, Nate. I'm Neil. I'm a software developer at Substack.
Hey.
I'm a big fan of your Substack. I also love the Risky Business podcast you do with Maria. And I was curious kind of how writing and podcasting as work feel to you, maybe similarly or differently. And then from a business perspective, like how your different projects fit into your overall livelihood.
Yeah, look, I mean, the good thing is like all the things I'm doing like speak to one another. One nice thing about a podcast is that you can turn it around pretty fast and be like a little bit more off the cuff. And so when you're used to doing things that require more rigor, then it's kind of a very nice complement to that. Sometimes we get a lot of kind of listens on the podcast from when we just like embed the Spotify clip on Substack. It's a good way. I mean, look, because people are like, how are you doing all these things? Well, it's kind of all the same thing in different in different venues, I think. But Maria's also great. I mean, she's a very good friend of mine, and we kind of like bounce ideas off of one another, I think, and kind of check each other a little bit potentially. But look, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, we're going through this phase now where I have this interview today, and then next week I have like 7 or 10 interviews for the book, and I'm going to be a little bit overexposed. But the fact is that like probably occasional bouts of overexposure are okay, right? If you can sustain someone's attention for a couple of weeks at a time from a strictly selfish incentive, then it's probably good for like selling different things. Also, though, like the way this particular election has played out has been very fortuitous, because this decision Democrats have to make about Joe Biden is kind of all about risk assessment in real time. So it's like not like the model is this abstract thing which is separate from everything else. It's like this kind of actually affects how people are behaving and whether they're making kind of good strategic choices.
Thanks.
Hey guys, Nate, it's Catherine, head of politics.
Hey.
How's it going? So you
Good.
wrote that Biden should drop out. Did anyone reach out that surprised you? I obviously read every comment on that post. And did any reaction shock you?
Nobody from the Biden team, if that's what you're asking. Well, I'm not sure I'd say if they did, right? But like, no, in general, I do not get like phone calls or emails from the Democratic establishment, right? I think they understand that like I'm not really going to be influenced by what they say. I'm not, generally speaking, kind of like friendly with them socially. So I hear from like lots of interesting people in like business and media and things like that, and there are like a lot of DMs exchanged, but I'm really not kind of immersed in that like Democratic, or for that matter even the kind of like Republican politics world. I mean, because by definition the model has a strict set of rules that I designed, before the election starts, and like I'm not going to like shift anything or shade everything, and every now and then you'll get like a little bit of a tidbit, but like no, I'm deliberately kind of trying to specialize and not provide like an insider's view about election stuff.
All right, you mentioned for a second Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
You're a betting man. Do you have a date in your head for when Biden would drop out if he chooses to do so?
Look, so we have a week in between the end of the RNC and the start of the Olympics. It's kind of Friday to Friday. Every Democrat has now dropped their anonymous ammunition from Nancy Pelosi to Barack Obama, implying that he should drop out.
Adam Schiff
that
yesterday.
That week's going to be very tough for Biden to survive. If he does, then I guess he's kind of somewhat bulletproof and impervious, although you still could, technically speaking, have the delegates at the convention decide to exercise what's a conscience clause and say, I don't want to support him. He also has COVID now. I don't know how that affects things as much. Look, I mean, Joe Biden for his whole career has been a party guy. a guy who is kind of at the median of the Democratic Party and has kind of navigated the internal politics of the party as best as he can. The fact that you have Pelosi and Schumer and Obama and all his big donors saying that your money's drying up, Democrats want you to leave, the House and senators want you to leave because they think you'll cost them these races. I mean, I don't know, Joe Biden, and you worry it is a kind of proverbial taking grandpa's car keys away situation. There are some leaks from the White House. You can kind of, you can kind of like chart a linear trajectory where now there are leaks coming from the White House and maybe from the kind of inner circle. I don't know. I mean, since I am a betting man, prediction markets say a 75 or 8% chance he'll drop out. I mean, that seems probably about right. I thought they were too low before. For a while, they were like 40 or 50, and I thought the dominoes were falling toward a certain outcome. But, it's hard to go higher than like 75 or 80 because he is one guy. If he really doesn't want to get out, then you have to have a very nuclear fight at the convention or with the 25th Amendment or things like that, which is technically doable. But would they go that nuclear? I don't know. But, I mean, look, he'd have to be incredibly stubborn to to stay in the race. And I guess he's 81 years old and he's the president. So maybe he will be.
And he's a Scorpio, known to be stubborn.
Yeah, I didn't know he was a Scorpio. Yeah, for sure. Maybe I better lower. Maybe I should take the under on 75% then.
Final question. Have been following your election forecasts very, very closely. You warned on debate night that this would not have an immediate impact and wouldn't quite show up yet.
Yeah.
Has it shown up in the way that you anticipate it will? And is that going to swing even wider over the next couple weeks?
So it's fallen from Biden at 35% before the debate to 28% as of this afternoon. So on one hand, 35 and 28 aren't that different. On the other hand, he was already losing, and now you're kind of in a bigger hole. In some sense, we're still waiting for more high-quality state polling. What happened? You had the debate, then you had the July 4th weekend, then you have this convention, right? So it's kind of been a little bit too rapid fire, the developments for the polling to kind of really settle in. It wouldn't surprise me if he's down to 20% or 25% in a couple of weeks if he's still in the race. By the way, we also have the convention. Typically, when a party holds a convention, then it gets a boost in the polling, a so-called convention bounce. The model will account for that. If Trump shoots way up, it'll say, okay, then maybe it should be the enthusiasm over the convention, which is a big advertisement, and J.D. Vance and whatnot. But it has shown a change. I mean, it has the model was pretty smart about identifying that after 3 days. It's been pretty stable at 28% roughly since then.
Okay, fine. One more question, Chris. J.D. Vance. I read your piece about J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
When does Vance impact Trump's numbers?
Because he was announced the first day of the convention, then it'll be hard to separate out any VP effect from the convention mounts, and from that matter, from the fact that someone tried to shoot and kill former President Trump this past weekend. I thought Vance was kind of a mediocre pick, that he'd be kind of very red meat for conservatives. However, his speech at the convention last night was much more moderate, trying to be kind of like the everyman dad guy who's kind of striking the reasonable center, right? Which is different from how, I attended the GOP convention in 2016. It was a much darker kind of literally and figuratively convention. So showing the awareness that we are trying to play for the center. And yes, believe me, I think there are lots of Republican policies I disagree with. There are lots of things like January 6th that I thought Trump did that are very scary and frightening. But if you look at how the parties are behaving, then Republicans seem to want to win, whereas Democrats seem to want to not piss off the wrong people. Although to their credit, the non-Biden parts of the Democratic Party, I think, have actually been pretty rational here. They've concluded to a strong consensus that they don't want Biden to be their nominee, which is a dramatic and risky step, although I think the correct step to take. And now it's just a question of tactics for how do you force him out of the race. And I think they've decided that turning up the pressure a little bit at a time, right? At first it's anonymous leaks, and then it's some backbencher congressman, and then it's George Clooney, and now it's Nancy Pelosi, and now the Obama bomb is ready to drop. And so I think they've been kind of, one person I follow compared it to what you do with a toddler, right? Like I don't have kids myself, right? But like at first you try to like implant the suggestion that, hey, the toddler, let's do it diplomatically. This is going to be good for you, right? And then you kind of say, well, it's going to be my way or the highway. And then you turn to like threats and things like that, right? Or punishment. So I think you can kind of follow a trajectory of I think, by the way, this is based on two things, one of which is the fact that they think Biden will hurt them in individual states and districts. The reason being that they have found, according to the New York Times' article about this, that when Democrats go on TV and say, oh, Joe Biden seems like he's doing great, that's such obvious BS, given his limitations in terms of public speaking and presentation, that it harms their credibility. So when you can't defend that position, then that's going to hurt your numbers and ruin the overall party brand, potentially. And the fact that the White House has behaved in a way where they've run a very bad bluff. They've had a very weak hand in a lot of ways, as we've been talking about. They tried to bully people and strong-arm people and kind of threaten to take the party down with them, and that doesn't really work. If they had said from the start, after the debate, that, like, look, Joe Biden was really tired. He's going to come out and do an hour-long press conference at 2 p.m. today. The reason he's doing it at 2 p.m. today is that at 9 a.m. today, he went and saw a neurologist and saw his doctor just for another checkup. The last one was 4 months ago, and we'll release all that documentation in 4 days, and we believe he'll beat President Trump, right? And they didn't do that. They kind of like hid for a week, and then I don't know. I mean, they have a really bad hand to play.
Except for the Vogue cover.
Yeah, no, I mean the Vogue cover. I mean that was not ideally timed. Yeah, maybe in some universe, like maybe Jill Biden gave Joe like NyQuil, and she's like, maybe I'll emerge as the presidential candidate instead, right? I think that hasn't been talked about too much, but in House of Cards or something that would happen. But I think Democrats have this capture problem where because they kind of do dominate the media so much that they mistake winning the media narrative with winning the election, with winning over kind of swing voters and everything else. When it comes to things like Joe Biden's age, it's just an extremely self-evident problem. And yeah, now and then you do have these 80-year-olds who are kind of like super agers. Maybe Bernie Sanders is a super ager. To me, he seems still very mentally sharp at 81 years old. If you're not in that category, then it's pretty obvious. I mean, if you watch clips of like, this is what kind of really shocked me, is Ezra Klein wrote a column in like February saying, oh, Biden should drop out. And he's like, just kind of compare this clip of Biden from 4 years ago with this clip of Biden now, and the degree of negative progression there, just how much worse he looks and sounds than 4 years ago, is kind of undeniable, and you can't kind of lie your way through everything. You can lie your way through some things, but Democrats have gotten in this thing where they think everything is just vibes, right? Oh, age is just vibes. Inflation is just vibes, right? Actually, prices aren't so bad. It's like, no, people actually do have some grounded experience in reality, and it's complicated in a lot of ways. But you have to stay grounded in some type of truth, and because otherwise you just kind of lose credibility. So there's something kind of poetic about the arc of Democrats' kind of epistemological shortcomings coming up to bite them here. And yet they might actually get a miraculous second chance if they're smart enough to nudge Joe Biden out of the race. I mean, I think Harris would be an underdog, but it would be a real race and probably a competitive result in November, and they might get a second chance.
Do you read anything into Kamala Harris being with Roy Cooper right now? There are people in the line, and I'm just blowing them off right now.
I think she has done probably a pretty good job of signaling, based on the fact that they haven't been able to put her fingerprints behind everything. Yeah, look, I'm sure she thinks that, like, what the fuck, right? This guy can barely even read a complete sentence. I'm the extremely qualified, she's not a great politician, but I think she's perfectly qualified, right? I'm the vice president. He picked me out of all the other people in the world to succeed in if something like this happens, and like what the fuck is he doing? So I think they played it pretty well to drop like subtle little hints here and there. When Gretchen Whitmer tweeted about Harris and Biden the other day, she said Harris's name first and Biden's name second. So like, I think there are definitely like signals and everything that people they're intentional more often than not. Hey.
Oh man. My name is Jasmine. I work on Substack's product team. I know, obviously, I read your newsletter. It's great. Lots of thinking about risk and the future and predictions. So Substack's founders are fortunately not 80 yet. Thank you, Chris. Hoping for your health. I am very curious as a risk expert and nowadays more kind of a blogging Substack media expert. What do you think are the biggest risks for Substack's 5-year business trajectory?
Just to state the obvious one, I mean, I think there's some chance that you'll get competitors that try to offer something superior, but like I think Substack has enough of a head start, both in terms of feature development and in terms of the network, that it's likely to be fairly sticky. Look, I think at some point there could be subscription fatigue or newsletter fatigue. I think people have been very premature about that in declaring that so far. There is something weird where like some person you barely heard of, be like, oh yeah, I'll pay $8 a year to like read them, right? Whereas some like publication with 30 people are like $80 for the Atlantic. That's way too much, right? I mean, I subscribe to the Atlantic, so I love the Atlantic, etc. But look, I think you guys have a first mover advantage, and that matters a lot for a business like this. But like, yeah, you could see competitors. I don't know, but I don't have any like non-obvious. And look, I think the bigger worries are like, what does an organization like the Atlantic do? Where there's a lot of like very smart, informed opinion there. Currently, I think there are a lot of journalists who would make more money at Substack than they would working for a big periodical somewhere. It's not for everyone. You have to be kind of a self-starter. You have to be able to write pretty well without necessarily having a ton of editing. You kind of have to have an established, like that's one thing I worry about a little bit is like what can Substack do to help unearth new talent? I can think of some examples of people who have discovered on Substack, but like, to the extent product can put like a little thumb on the scale for discovery, I think that's really important and valuable. But like overall, I think the fundamentals of the business seem like they're in a pretty good place. Because it's also like not an overly complicated idea. You know what I mean? It's like it's not trying to like do 12 different things at once. It's like a couple of kind of, I think, streamlined product lines, and I think those businesses are more robust, generally speaking, right? Like have a clear value proposition and execute on things really well.
That's reassuring. What do you think is the 5-year risk for Silver Bulletin? Is it just that you get bored or you decide to play poker all day, or?
Yeah, look, I think there's a risk that like, kind of working for a big corporation for 10 years, you kind of probably store up like a squirrel storing nuts, right? You store up a lot of ideas of things that you can't write about a little bit. I think I'd kind of figure out where on the spectrum between a personal newsletter and something a bit larger Silver Bulletin is, right? There's a world where I never want to hire like 30 people, but there's a world where you'd hire 5 or 6 people, we have a politics data guy, hire like a sports data person, hire 2 editors, hire a designer and like a business side person, right? Like that universe might make sense, but then you're giving up a little bit of freedom that way, potentially. So yeah, do I kind of want it to be like a personal newsletter that has an election model every now and then or something larger? Like, look, the numbers have been very encouraging. People have responded very favorably to the model stuff. And so, it's a nice problem to have. And now it's like a real revenue stream to look after and protect and to treat as a real business. But to try to figure out how to fit that into my lifestyle is something I'll worry about. Like, because for right now, through November, the lifestyle is shot, right? It's too much work. I need to trim my beard and get a haircut and things like that. So I'm kind of in sprint mode through November, and then after that, I'll take some time to assess.
Cool. Thank you, Nate. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Nate.
Hey, man. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm used to seeing you in New York. It's weird to see you in SF.
Yeah, I'm not at home here. It's totally out of place. I'm wondering about your view of the future of the media economy, given that you've seen everything and you're now here at Substack. Are you on an optimism level?
Yeah, look, I'd say I'm fairly pessimistic overall. I mean, I think there's still some degree of secular decline in the advertising bundle. I think the willingness to pay, including for Substack, is an encouraging sign. I think in terms of like, if you set aside the economics for a moment, I think media is having a relatively vibrant moment where there's kind of less groupthink of the kind of peak, whatever you want to call it, of 2020, right? It feels like you're freer to express different ideas in different venues, and you have kind of liberals and conservatives and the left and the right having more conversations again. So I think in terms of like the actual content, it's been like a overly necessary correction, right? I do think there's a worry about like a little bit of a winner-take-all economy. If you're an established name, and if you're not too abashed about learning how to like market yourself, and you have some like business savvy and some savvy for how the internet works, and you can do very well. I worry a little bit if you're like some reporter on the front lines in Ukraine or something, then that becomes like much harder to sustain through a subscriber newsletter model and things like that, right? So like for me, I feel like all these trends work pretty well, but I don't want to translate that into like, and for Substack, I think they also work pretty well, right? I don't want to translate that into like a huge amount of optimism for like what will like the Washington Post or the LA Times or whatever look like in 5 years.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks. And thanks for doing the talk.
Of course.
Hi, Nate. I'm Helen Tobin at Substack, and I'm going to ask the last question before Chris wraps it up. I'm curious how Notes is part of your Substack experience. Are you really active? I see you promoting your Substack. Are you finding new writers through Notes? What's your experience like with Notes?
So I really like the Notes platform. I'm not sure I've quite figured out how to balance kind of Notes versus Twitter, and oftentimes I'll kind of write the same thing on both. I mean, there is some, I think I have now, we are getting like an increasing amount of the audience, like 5 or 7% are actually people who are followers, but not subscribers, and so that's worthwhile. Because obviously, like anything you drive from the Substack platform has like much higher conversion rates to both free and paid signups, right? So you obviously notice that as a writer. Look, I like Notes a lot. I mean, I also have like a big audience on Twitter, so I kind of like hang out there more than I might otherwise. I think kind of some of the early problems with Elon have been stabilized a little bit. Actually, one thing I didn't kind of mention earlier when Chris asked is like, I am interested in like exploring more tools for kind of live blogging and kind of updating things live if I'm conveying thoughts from like a presidential convention or something like that. There are different ways to do that. Notes is one way I've tried once or twice. People also have like a chat function that they've used, but for like kind of real-time updates, like that would be a feature that would be on my request list, I think. But no, I like Notes. I'm happy that you guys are going. I guess this is not the way that you want it framed, but I'm happy that you're providing alternatives to Twitter. Because although I'm not super down on Twitter, I'm not a big fan of these platforms that are just kind of Mastodon and Blue Sky that seem to have been very kind of captured by a certain type of person that was, I think, very annoying on Twitter, and now they all are kind of all in one place. But more platforms that are founded by people that believe in free speech. I don't mean that in an overly ideological way, right? But I'm a fan of that too. It's like another reason why I tend to stick with Substack.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay.
Can you give a round of applause for Nate in San Francisco?
Thank you, everybody.
The book is On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. Your phenomenally successful Substack is available at natesilver.net. Is there anything else we can plug for you while you're here?
I have too many things to plug, so that's enough. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming on my Substack, for talking to the team. Thank you for using Substack, and thank you for making the world more interesting. Cheers.